United States earns 10 times more than the average Negro wage earner of 12 years ago. The national income of the Negro is now a little better than $28 billion a year, which is more than all of the exports of the United States and more than the national budget of Canada. This reveals that we have made some strides in this area. But probably more than anything else, and you've read about it so much here and all over the world, I'm sure, we have noticed a gradual decline and even demise of the system of racial segregation. Now, the legal history of racial segregation had its beginning in 1896. Many people feel that racial segregation has been a reality in the United States a long time, but the fact is that this was a rather recent phenomenon in our country, just a little better than 60 years old. And it had its legal beginning with a decision known as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which said in substance that separate but equal facilities could exist, and it made the doctrine of separate but equal the law of the land. We all know what happened as a result of the old Plessy doctrine. There was always a strict enforcement of the separate, without the slightest intention to abide by the equal. And the Negro ended up being plunged into the abyss of exploitation, where he experienced the bleakness of nagging injustice. But then something marvelous happened. The Supreme Court of our nation in 1954 examined the legal body of segregation, and on May 17th of that year pronounced it constitutionally dead. It said in substance that the old Plessy doctrine must go, that separate facilities are inherently unequal, and that to segregate a child on the basis of his race is to deny that child equal protection of the law. And
so there you have it, Margie. Just giving you.
You said a little clip of that because he didn't talk at all about apartheid.
Yeah, I think it's.
How long is the clip?
It's a long one. It's like 59 minutes.
So we need to learn how to clip out.
Yeah. What I'm gonna do, tonight I'm gonna just continue let it play for people who want to listen to it, and then I'm gonna just come back and stop it. Talking about segregation. That's Martin Luther King talking about things that we never hear about.
That's true.
We only hear about I have a dream. That one day. Let me play that song for you. I have a dream that one day.
I think you should play Blowing in the Wind. That's what you should do.
Blowing in the wind? What?
The answer, my friend, is Blowing in the Wind.
I don't want to play that. Why would we play that?
Well, because people were singing it the other day, and it's still on my mind. So.
There's an MLK rap, right? You ever heard that one?
No, I never heard that.
Seriously?
Apartheid South Africa learned a lot of its segregationist practices from the United States. I just read this quick line here for whatever it's worth, that someone said that they watched U.S. Air Force people arrive in South Africa and help deliver these signs that said, whites only and colored around the back. And Martin Luther King, in many ways, his legacy, at least here in the United States, his memory is like that of Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely correct.
And I really hate, or don't hate, but I sometimes have to allude to kids because kids really don't know much. But I remember reading, Nelson Mandela was a man of peace, and he wanted whites and blacks to live together. And he went to jail and became president. So, it's sort of like the Martin Luther King, I have a dream, I'm black and I get assassinated, narrative. That's pretty, way too succinct and not giving the full credit. I remember Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist, and the ANC which he was a leader of, not the leader, but a leader of the African National Congress, was considered a terrorist organization. And they, too, were followed in the United States and would have, up until, a year or so ago, been considered on the terrorist watch list. The African National Congress, they did have a mission in the United States and United Nations and a permanent representatives, but they were not considered a legal entity or a respected entity by the federal government, at least not outright. I think that the federal government must have known at some point that apartheid would end and all these leaders in the ANC would ultimately end up running the government and in some ways actually help fund their education here in the United States, which I know definitely about. One thing that the United States does, and they did this through the United States Agency of International Development, they would have different people from liberation movements and sponsor them through different non-governmental organizations to go to school. And the goal of here in the U.S. is to get them to be more friendly toward the United States in case the inevitable happens, which is their liberation. And once they're liberated, they would be more friendly to the United States. But for the most part, the ANC was not a friend of the U.S. And, Cuba or the Soviet Union or any of those other countries that were socialist actually helped fund those organizations. When Nelson Mandela was released officially, publicly from prison, not officially, but publicly from prison, because, when you read his story or saw the movie or whatever, you saw that the apartheid government had put him up in a house, for over a year, where some of his comrades were still in jail. And he did insist on their release, and they were released a little bit, eventually. But when he was released, I was in Tanzania at the time, and that was one of the first countries he came to, because a lot of those countries in southern Africa, also known then as the frontline states, had supported all these people who were in exile. And so he came to Tanzania, and maybe a week, 2-3 weeks later, we left Tanzania and came to the United States. And I remember watching Roz Abrams, the gentle grandfather. They had called him a gentle grandfather, and had given him total credit for ending apartheid. And, here right in front of me, because this was a struggle that I was totally deep into and very much involved in. I just thought that it was discredited a whole entire organization that existed and educated people and advocated for their own freedom while Nelson Mandela was in jail. But, people do need an icon, and so he became the icon. But to say that he did it alone without the help or the assistance of the ANC and along with Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, it was just Nelson Mandela by himself who did all this while he was in jail. It wasn't, he just kept the struggle going all on his own. And so, again, here's another way where our history has been retold and revisited. But back to Roz Abrams, who had referred to him as a gentle grandfather, rather than looking at this as a man who founded or was one of the founders of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC that went around blowing up stuff. And so, rather than talk about that aspect of him, this lawyer, that aspect of him, they would prefer to call him a gentle grandfather who
Maybe
did
that's what they
everything
told her she had to say.
through diplomacy. And this is what they've done, as we, were talking about on Sunday, the sanitization of Martin Luther King. And they've done the same thing with Nelson Mandela to take away his militancy, to take away his desire to fight back by whatever means necessary once negotiation did not work.
They didn't do that to Malcolm X, right?
No, they didn't do that. No, they vilified him and made him seem like,
a militant.
A militant, but not just a militant, but, juxtaposed him and said, well, there are two ways you can take. Now, when you look at Malcolm X, though, here you have the Nation of Islam, yes, who, and I think probably their biggest threat was that they wanted to be as self-reliant as possible. So they had their newspaper, and they had their housing, and then they had their own churches, which they did not, or not churches, but temples, which they did not allow white people to come into. They tried to do economic self-sufficiency. And I think that may have been a problem, because when you integrate, that means you integrate your money as well. And so they wanted to keep it all into the community. But it was just another method of fighting back and seeking self-determination and feeling pride in yourself, rather than vilifying them as some organization. Because, as it has been pointed out to me, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, they never hurt anybody and never got anybody in any violent situation.
And they never terrorists, no terrorists.
They never did anything. But, they just kept the money within their group. However, and they were trying
for
whatever
it's worth. Get kids off
Martin
drugs,
Luther King did lead people
street.
into situations where people got their ass beat, and got beat up and sicked on by dogs and hit by water hoses. But, Malcolm X, they were like, we stand up here, They didn't involve themselves in any of that. And, the value of the nonviolent movement and having these images in front of newspapers and the television that was becoming a major media at that time did help soften the hearts of white people and black people, but white people who did not like seeing other human beings being mistreated. And I think that was one of the ways that legislation ended up being changed, and people... legislation, I'll just say, and policies being changed. But it wasn't just one thing, because they were afraid of Malcolm X, they were afraid of the Black Panthers, and people said, listen, we're going to get a gun and fight back and control our own community, or rather patrol our own community. Organizations like the Deacons for Defense, who walked around with guns, and said, we're going to shoot you down if you come after us. So there were a number of agencies, as we had mentioned, that the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program led by the FBI, sought to discredit and destroy. So there's no one way to do anything. So I guess everyone's voice gets heard, but at the end, when the story is written, it seems to be written to say that there was only one voice, right? Or to sanitize Mandela or King. And if that's the case, or just make the people disappear, because we don't hear anything about Patrice Lumumba, who we know was killed by the CIA. There's just so many others that
they said Kwame Ture was poisoned.
Yeah, we don't know why. I mean, these people are not part of the history, and so all people say is that, Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King. And
they said Malcolm X was also assassinated. The person was actually put up to assassinate Malcolm X.
Well, I don't get into that.
But here is this. You know this author named Dinesh D'Souza?
I've seen Dinesh, D-I-N-E-S.
Yes. He has views on color blindness and the importance of discussing race that are so ridiculous. Even Fox host Megyn Kelly isn't buying. Now, when Megyn Kelly doesn't buy it, there may be something wrong with it. All right? Let's see if we can bring this up here. This is Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh D'Souza. It's funny. There is D'Souzas in Trinidad and Tobago.
What's an Indian name?
It's an Indian name, yeah.
Yeah.
And there are, I don't know if they were in Trinidad. They weren't really Indian. They were light-skinned, because, there was a D'Souza who played for the Trinidad and Tobago cricket team. But I don't think he was a,
Indian?
Indian, yeah.
Well, I have some Hispanic, I'm not Hispanic, Southeast Asian students. One's last name is Rodrigo. Another one is Souza. So, I mean, again, it just, shows the prevalence of imperialism and the corporation, or the company, or the European powers going all over the world and, changing the names of people or having an impact on people's last names for whatever they're worth. So we're listening.
Well, we got to keep, because
D'Souza, yes.
Yeah,